UX Podcast Episode 309.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to UX Podcast, coming to you from Stockholm, Sweden. We are your hosts, Per Axbom.
And James Royal Lawson.
Balancing business, technology, people, and society with listeners all over the world, from the Czech Republic to San Marino.
And for this episode, we are bringing you, once again, a link show.
Woohoo!
And as I would normally say, or one of us would normally say, a link show is where Per and I have gone through the entire internet and we've looked and read absolutely everything that's out there, been written in recent weeks, and pulled out just two articles that we think are worth talking about. I may well be exaggerating in what I've just said.
We always call this our digital travels.
We find them on our digital travels.
Yeah. And the two articles are one that you found that I wasn't aware of, actually, talking about
container queries land in stable browsers.
What is a stable browser? Is that for horses?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I'd be able to be careful about just saying yes when you say things like that, because people might actually believe me. That's an article by Una Kravitz.
And the second article we'll be talking about today is
Design Thinking Was Supposed to Fix the World. Then there's a subtitle which is Where Did It All Go Wrong? And that's by Rebecca Ackerman.
Yes, on MIT Technology Review. That's a quite long one. We'll start off with container queries, I think.
So this first one, container queries land in stable browsers. And stable browsers is not something to do with horses. Actually, what it means is that this particular feature is now available in all the three major web browser engines. And this article is by Una Kravitz, who works with Google Chrome. She's one, like Katie, we talked to quite a while back about other features from Google Chrome. They're part of a team of engineers that, communicate and discuss things that are happening and share it with the world. But I picked this one because I think it's a really meaningful development. If we go back a bit, this feature has actually been around since the autumn, but I think September. But what happened this month in February is that Firefox added support, meaning that we've hit now the milestone of that all the major rendering engines, Safari and then the Chromium ones, are all supporting this. So that means you're kind of at a point where you can probably dare to use it. But I'll get back to that a little bit. I wanted to back up even further with this one and explain that, or just point out that as designers, if we're working with design in web browsers, we've probably been working with and aware of responsive design and breakpoints for quite a number of years now.
We talked about it. Early days when we started this podcast is when people started really implementing responsive design.
Yeah, I mean it's over 10 years ago now when we've talked about it, and we even brought Brad Frost in reasonably early on to talk about responsive design and designing for mobiles. But there's been something called media queries in CSS for quite a long time as well now, and media queries are for basically using the type of place where we're displaying the content to dictate how the design will be displayed. So a media query would usually be for a type of media, so like print or screen, but then you can also target the qualities of that particular media. So you can use things like the viewport width or the screen orientation or even the pointer type Or these are all things that you can utilize to decide how you display something, how it gets rendered in the browser.
And when we say viewport, what does that mean, James?
Right, so you've got your screen and your screen size and screen resolution, but it's not always the case that the place where your web page is being rendered fills the entire screen.
Yeah.
So, for example, when I'm talking to you now, the web page of which the communication tool we're using to talk to each other, that's actually only probably, it's not even a third of my screen, and it's not the full height of my screen. It's just a portion of my screen. So the viewport is the little window of the browser where my page is being displayed. So it's rare. It pretty much can't be 100% of your screen, because there's always going to be some bit of the browser that's eating up a little bit of the physical screen. But sometimes it can be quite close to the whole thing. Like on mobile phones, for example, it's going to be very close to the whole screen size. But on a desktop machine, then it quite often can be very different to the resolution. But so media queries and responsive design, so breakpoints, are something we've been using for quite a long time. And when you get used to designing, okay, here's my design for when something is this wide. Here is my design for something when it's this wide, and so on.
People tend to think of desktop, tablet, mobile as those three major ones, but then that's the wrong way of thinking of it in my mind, because it can be so many other things as well.
Yeah, exactly. But the kind of quick way of dealing with that would be the small, medium, large. Yeah. Some days now, I'll when I'm doing analytics to do this thing, I'll often now do small, medium, large, and extra large. Yeah. And the reason why I've done that when it comes to gathering data about how these viewport sizes are is that we got so many of these giant curved monitors. I have one myself, and you can end up with some really wide rendering of web pages, and ridiculously wide. And you see a lot of, when I full size my browser on this screen, a lot of web pages kind of break, because I've got like 80 centimeters between the left hand side of the web page and the right hand side of the web page. So
if you have a menu bar and the links are in the top right, you'll struggle actually to find them.
Oh god, yeah. I had to go on a walk to get to the other side up there. Carry my mouse with me to move all the way up to the top right. But yeah, so that's all the kind of background and how we have media queries and where we come from. So what's happened now is we've got to the point where we can start using things called container queries. And I'll quote a bit from the article. With container queries, you can query the styling information of a parent element, such as its inline size. With media queries, you could query the size of the viewport. But container queries enable components that can change based on where they are in the UI. So what this means is, whereas previously we've been using breakpoints and media queries, so based on the viewport of the whole page, now we're this wide.
People, I think, will recognize this. Like if you have 3 columns of cards, then if you have a wide one, you'll see those 3 columns as designed. But if you have a small screen, like on a mobile, the same cards get layered on top of each other.
Yeah. And there'll be a snap. There'll be a point where you get in the screen width, then when suddenly we change to that look.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So what container queries allow you to do is, instead of basing it on the entire viewport of the screen, you can now go, okay, I'm a component, and I want to look like this when the place I'm sat in is this big. So we can now target things a little bit smaller, a little bit more contextually. And it is a massive step forward, really, when it comes to how we're working, how we design, because it effectively enables us to design how we've always wanted to design. That, I do a card, for example, and, I want the card to look like this when it's in this size space. And I want it to look like this when it's in this size space, a little bit bigger. And that's been always something that you get pushback on. Oh, no, we can't do that. What do you mean you can't do it? Well, no, because I've got no way of knowing how big a space I'm in. is what the devs would kind of like come back to
Yeah,
and
because they
always
only
say.
know the size of the viewport.
That's ultimately the only thing
Yeah.
that they've got to play with in a lot of situations. And you end up having then to go, okay, then this is how it's going to look on tablet. This is how it's going to look on mobile, because you got to fall into the media, the media query and the breakpoint. Now, like I said, we can actually, with container queries, it can be implemented in a way which is relative to the place it's sat in. And cards are by far the best, or the most easy way of, I think anyway, of communicating the impact of that.
Of understanding it, yeah.
Yeah, understanding it, because cards are reusable components. So here we get into why this can be such a big impact for so many of us, because we work in design systems with reusable components. And if you are working with reusable components in a design system, then now you can finally actually have proper reusable components that do work in different contexts, rather than just this is how it looks in a mobile viewport. This is how it looks in a desktop viewport.
So from my example before, when we had 3 columns with 3 cards, and you have a lower resolution, often what will happen then is, like I said, the 3 cards will layer on top of each other. But what I like about this is that it makes more sense now, and it's much easier to implement the fact that when I get smaller, I may now have 2 columns, and the third card actually doesn't flip down and be on its own row, but it can actually be as wide as the 2 other cards, because the container that it's inside is now wider. So it can become wider even though the width of the viewport is actually more narrow.
Yeah, I mean, you can literally have. You can also, though, you can have the same card twice on the same page.
And in different sizes.
Yeah, and some of the cards are actually just in a different. Like you could have some cards appearing in the left-hand column and in the main body, and the ones in the left-hand column are your kind of mobile cards.
Yeah,
and the ones in the body are your kind of like desktop search results kind of cards. But it's the same thing.
It's the same card, yeah.
It's the same code. It's just basically using CSS to go, I'm over here now. I only have this much space. I'll look like this.
I can see how excited you are about this, but
I've talked now for 10 minutes about something which is just like one feature.
Visualize. Well, it sounds extremely technical, but I think that again comes down to what we as designers, we need to know the material we're working with. So previously, like you were saying, we may have asked questions, can't we do it like this? And you may have gotten a no. And it's important to understand things you may have gotten a no for in the past may actually be possible now.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we are both advocates of designers being able to understand some of the concepts of coding, like this one. And for me, that's always been the same thing as like, well, you're not going to be an architect without understanding gravity, or you're not going to be kind of you're not going to work with pottery unless you have some idea how clay works. It's kind of like understanding the medium you're working with, and just this particular one, I think. Even if you don't fully understand the technicalities of this feature, this is going to revolutionize in some situations your communication with devs. That now, rather than kind of like you saying, I'd really like this card to behave like this, instead of just kind of getting some kind of deep sigh and like a whole kind of pushback and like a sad looking dev who's trying to explain again why he can't, or why they can't, suddenly you could get the eyes lighting up. And your dev team looks at you and go, oh, excellent, we can do it like this, and it's so much simpler.
And I've even seen myself realizing that I've worked the QR code, where the challenge has been that sometimes when you have low vision and you don't actually see the browser, but you're perhaps using a screen reader, or you have low vision and you're zooming, and you have to scan a QR code on screen. That has provided a huge challenge. And I had to solve that with viewport sizes and making all these different types of calculations. But what I'm realizing now, as we're talking, the way I would implement that now, knowing this, is completely different. It would be much, much easier. We don't appreciate responsive design enough, I think. We take it for granted. So onwards to this MIT Technology Review article. Design thinking was supposed to fix the world. Where did it go wrong? An approach that promised to democratize design may have done the opposite. And this one's by Rebecca Ackerman, who's a freelance journalist, and she's done a ton of research. I understand you saw her mention this on Twitter, I think.
Yeah, months of research is what Rebecca says she's done to this article.
And I really wanted to do this one because it's a lengthy one, but it's a fantastic read. And
listen! I noticed they've got listened to this article on MIT,
yeah,
and it's almost a 28-minute listen.
Yeah, just to listen to it is almost as long as this show. I always appreciate when we question our own tools and methodologies in the design space. And I think we have to acknowledge and be aware, because that means that if people are criticizing in the way that we can gather from this article, we need to be talking about design in different ways and probably performing it in different ways as well. And this article, at the outset, it talks, of course, about how IDEO helped market design thinking to the world. And the first paragraph talks about a workshop that's attended by a person by the name of Kyle Cornforth. And of course, it's magical, this workshop, with all these Post-its everywhere and prototypes everywhere. And this was like this framework for collaboration and creation. Of course, people are happy within the workshop, but I love this first questioning of what did we actually perform? What was the outcome of the workshop? And she looked at the ideas themselves, and this is the quote. I was like, you didn't talk to anyone who works in a school, did you? They were not contextualized in the problem at all.
Yeah. But it's got I love the bit in the opening bit as well, Per. The whole way she gets across the feeling of that kind of, there's those workshops. Key to design thinking spread was its reputable aesthetic presented by the Post-it note, a humble square that anyone could use in infinite ways, not too precious, not too permanent. The ubiquitous Post-it promises a fast-moving, cooperative, egalitarian process for getting things done. It's kind of, there's momentum and enthusiasm kind of embodied in the way she describes them.
Exactly. So it's alluring, just the way of doing it, and that I think that's key to the article as well. And then now I realize I didn't even mention that this first workshop it was about the edible schoolyard project. So this was about using gardening and cooking in schools to teach and provide nutritious food. So that's why they didn't talk to anyone who worked in a school. That's why she was so surprised about this.
Yeah, that was IDEO.
They had all these ideas, but they weren't anchored in reality.
Yeah, it was IDEO that was that behind that research and that project.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you noticed, Per, but halfway down the article, there is a really interesting parenthesis. In brackets, it just says, IDEO.org declined to be interviewed for this story.
Yes, I've noticed that as well, yes.
The brackets for me were really interesting.
Because
it was added halfway down in brackets, almost like kind of almost quietly, as in the company that we're mentioning a lot in this article and is behind this format, I guess you could say, has been pushed out there, didn't take part in actually being interviewed for it and research.
That's very true. Yeah, but there are quotes from some of the founders
of
books and articles.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And then the project that gets quoted a lot as well is also school and food related, but it's another project. It was the San Francisco Unified School District who wanted to redesign their school cafeteria. And this one's interesting because this is on the IDEO website as a successful project. And as the article says, 10 years on, this has had a big impact, but it may have more to do with the slow and integrated work inside the district and the school rather than that first push of design-focused energy from the outside in the beginning, which were, I don't know how much time they spent, but a couple of months, I guess.
Yeah, that was the thing where the actual recommendations that came out of the design thinking process hadn't really been implemented.
Exactly.
But they had implemented some of the kind of some other aspects to change the space to be more. So the cafeterias were then changed to be more a better experience of eating them.
I think, it's good you bring this up already now because they return to this more at the end of the article. But it's interesting because they had these ideas, but they did not take into account the complexities of the district's operations. And I love this one. And the effort it could take to even drill a hole in a wall in accordance with asbestos abatement rules. So there are things you have to do to actually accomplish what the suggestions are, but those haven't been taken into account at all. Because you have these great ideas. And of course, how hard can it be to drill a hole in a wall? Well, apparently it can be very hard to drill a hole in a wall.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing with the app, because, oh, you need the app. Oh, but that would have required a whole new department to continually update the software and content.
I think it's fascinating, especially when you think about the episode before this, episode 208, when we're talking about systems thinking. That design thinking really didn't, gear itself up to be, to be iterative, I guess, or even to consider the system that the interventions were playing out in. It's like you're saying now, it's like, oh yeah, we're going to do all these kind of grand designs of how the cafeteria should be, but we didn't take into account there might be asbestos in the walls and we aren't allowed to drill into them, which you would pick up perhaps if you had a more holistic systems thinking approach to it. Design thinking is more solve, instruct someone to build, and then move on.
Right, and that's a big important thing you're bringing up there. Instruct someone to build, because sometimes you don't even instruct someone to build. Sometimes you do the workshop, you come with the suggestions, and then you leave it with the organization, and they have to find someone to implement. So, and as I'm saying this, I'm aware, of course, that everyone does this differently, and I'm sure that not everyone listening is doing this in the way that we're describing right now. But the problem is that many are, and design thinking has become this sort of religion wherein people say that we'll apply the design thinking process and everything will turn out all right. At least it has been like that for a long time. And of course, now I think over the past 2-3 years, people have been questioning it more and more.
There's a quote right towards the end, I think, by Scott Dawley, who summarizes what students are saying to him when reflecting on the design thinking process. The students were saying, I want to make something that not only changes things, but changes things without screwing everything else up.
Yeah. And that's a good way of summarizing. Then this part of the article actually talks about how IDEO themselves are actually trying to reconfigure what design thinking means and how they're teaching it. So that's what they're hoping for their students, that this is how they reason, and they're trying to get more equity into it. They're realizing, because design thinking has been critiqued also, of course, for it's a lot of Western thinking and Western people coming into a space and deciding that we're going to solve this using this fantastic tool. So it's like magical thinking as well. And it's more oppressive than we would probably like to admit.
I think that ties in with the whole how might we thing.
Yeah.
Because that was another of the tools that came out of IDEO and the process they had was the how might we. And there's been a lot of talk and write-ups and criticism over the we in all this process. That
exactly
yes. What you're saying with the privilege and who you are. That the we is the people in the room, the people that they bother to include in the process, and how that in many situations was often white and educated and all the other kind of weird things that we normally list there, not really in many cases the actual people, like you said, kids in the school or whatever having the meals. They're not exactly in there saying how they might do it.
So it's not only that design thinking doesn't even, sometimes it even omits that crucial final step of implementation, is what the article says as well, which is interesting. But it's not only about omitting the implementation, it's not even thinking about the aftermath, what takes place years after the implementation. Design thinking is at the very, very beginning and takes responsibility for not much.
There was another quote, Carissa Carter, I think was this one was, that they'd come up with more questions in the process that she'd adapted to bring more care into it all. And they added questions about how are we thinking about our ancestors? What is a legacy that this is going to leave? What are all the intended and unintended consequences? So, like you said, to kind of think beyond just this kind of initial thinking. What else can we bring in to ensure this has some kind of positive legacy?
Now, the interesting thing about all this, and this is something I took away from some quotes from Sid Harrell, one of our favorite people in the design space, is that design thinking may have provided benefits, but not the benefits that we may intuitively think, but actually the fact that, like we were saying in the beginning, it's an exciting process. It gets people excited and energized within the space of the workshop and the collaboration and talking to other people, which usually happens within an organization but not outside. But at least it gets people out of their normal way of working, and that can itself have a benefit in that they get more excited about doing stuff in the future.
Yeah, I know. There's the whole thing where if you're working with civic tech or public sector initiatives, you might have been banging your head against a concrete wall for decades, and it's nice to have something that gives you some positivity and optimism and enthusiasm, and the methodology, perhaps despite its failures, does that, and that's what Sid does say in the article. And she says that often the biggest piece of the design problem in civic tech, as I said, is not generating new ideas, but figuring out how to implement and pay for them.
Yeah, and that's where the critique comes in as well, of course, because we're not helped by that at all when it comes to design thinking. At least in most cases, I'm sure people will be applying design thinking to those types of problems as well. But it's again this magical thinking that's problematic, in the sense that we're promising stuff, we're promising results from these types of workshops and this type of work, but it's not including the people it should be including in the work itself.
And before that was fine because we were moving fast and breaking things, Perry.
And that was okay in the old, exactly.
That's the whole point.
For some reason,
the magic you're talking about, the magic's fine because if we get out there quickly, then we're going to learn whether it works or not, so we can quickly change it again. So you're arguably limiting harm because the harm doesn't matter because it's only going to be a short time before we iterate.
Yeah,
maybe.
And I love the honesty that's presented, and that's why I think everyone should read this article. There's so many good quotes. You've shared a lot of them now, James, as well. But there's former IDEO designer George A. His quote about because you often have this beginner's mindset, and I think Tim Brown, one of the founders of IDEO as well, he had this suggestion that it's good to have a beginner's mindset as you come in. So there's no expertise involved really at all, because so anyone can go into any space and solve any problem is what they're saying. Mm-hmm. And what George A. says is that he and his colleagues would use the language of a beginner's mindset. But what he saw in practice was more an attitude that we're going to fumble our way through, and by the time we're done, we're on to the next project.
Oh, you see, there's just...
it's very honest. Yeah.
It's honest, but that whole kind of like agency mindset is worrying about this. Much... Okay, I'll say much. So many of the feelings I get from a lot of these frameworks and processes is not genuine usefulness. It's more, how do we package something so our agency can sell more projects? And like you've mentioned in this chat we've had now about how IDEO, they mention the success of a school project on their website. They promote it. They promote these projects as, look at the projects we've done. These are the badges we've got. Give us more badges. It's there's momentum in the agency world.
That's exactly what you're saying now. Give us more back. It's gamification. It's gamification of business, I guess. We can go out and promise, because that's what the article also, one of the conclusions is that the promise of design thinking was that anyone can do it as long as you follow the process, which was very attractive to companies, thinking that, well, I can just bring in this design agency and they can teach me design thinking, and then I don't need anyone else anymore. I don't need the experts.
Well, and like you just said as well, that the experts didn't even need to be experts. You could come in with the beginner's mindset. So it's perfectly packaged to be something you can roll out again and again and again and keep on selling. And another thing from it, another quote towards the end of it was talking about storytelling and how maybe storytelling was a key activity, but it was realised that maybe storytelling is the key activity. And if you listen to this podcast often, then you know that we talk a lot about communication and how so many aspects of design is just communicating to the next person, the other person or the other people. And storytelling is crucial. We've done a few shows about storytelling. That's some, like done linkshow and others talking about storytelling. But the feeling I got in the article when they mentioned storytelling was more connected to that feeling of sales, that feeling of persuasion, that we use storytelling as a way of getting the ideas as a result of our design thinking across. As in, we're selling those ideas and they're getting buy-in for the ideas, as opposed to genuine communication of a potential intervention.
Yeah. And this is, again, Tim Brown saying this. This is one of his realizations after many, many years working with these types of frameworks, is that I would never have guessed that we would have as many folks who come from a storytelling background within a design firm as we do today, because that's who they're bringing in. So, yes, I've felt that was kind of worrying as well, that we're still not really about doing the work.
Well, buy-in, I mean, this could be a whole different episode, just the whole thing about the need to get buy-in. I mean, we talk a lot about stakeholders and including stakeholders, but also, understanding organizations and like Sid talks about, getting the money to pay for stuff. I mean, we're constantly in situations where we need money to implement things, and I know that I've been so guilty. I mean, I know that over the years, I've packaged things in certain ways in order to get buy-in when I've actually got maybe other motives, or rather I've got something I really want to implement.
Yeah.
But I'm going to piggyback it, or I'm going to use another approach to get management or organizations on board because they want something, but they haven't got to the point of understanding maybe an underlying need. So, and I think this is somewhere where we often find ourselves as designers, or at least when working research, that you uncover insights, you uncover things, and sometimes they can be too controversial or too contrary or too much against an existing model of working.
Existing belief as well.
A belief, model of working, where you earn your money, all of these things that you can't just throw them in the face of the people who ultimately make the decisions. They've got to be, you've got to tell stories over a period of time, or you've got to communicate it over a period of time in a way that people accept and understand. And so I can understand that storytelling, I mean, it does work. Packaging things in a way does work to get buy-in for things to enable other things. But maybe it's a small criticism of what they were saying, that it's good intentions there, but I got that feeling of sales and persuasion. But that's probably built up because of the whole way the story talks about IDEO and their agency way of selling design thinking as a process over many years. So I'm kind of, I guess, a bit primed to be critical of the agency model.
Right, and I mean that's where all this comes from. That's why we have the models and frameworks, because they're easier to sell than bringing someone in to figure out the problem. Figure out the problem doesn't fit like in a box of a service. But in the end, I mean, it's all about recognizing now that yes, this tool maybe hasn't served everyone as well as we claim, or as many people claim in the industry, and it's something that we need to work more towards, is actually just decentering ourselves and decentering the powerful and the privileged, so that we can start working towards more equity and justice within the design space.
More care. And which I think is an excellent point. And like you brought up at the beginning here, that just having that critique of our tools, shows that we are maturing as a industry, as a branch or whatever, and that we can have those moments of reflection and look back at it and say, well, that worked, that didn't work. How can we do it better?
Exactly.
Some recommended listening before we close up for today.
Well, I love that Sid Harrell was in this article. So I think we've done, I don't know how many interviews with her. But
she's been in. We've done two proper interviews. She's been featured in episodes 247 and 194. But she also made a little kind of guest appearance on 193. So Research on the Fly is episode 194. That's an absolutely fantastic guide to doing research. And then we have Civic Tech with Sid Harrell, which we interviewed when we interviewed her about the time she released her book about civic tech. She created a friendly guide for people working in the public sector, although it's really good for anyone who's even not working in the public sector.
It is really good for everyone. Yeah.
Thank you for listening. We don't say thank you enough. And add us and subscribe to us wherever you're listening. If you already do it, if you just happen to be listening to this episode as a one-off. And if you are already a listener, you can always rate us and review us. I think that still makes a difference. Always used to.
I think so. I mean, all the other podcasts seem to say it. So go give us a review. It really makes a difference.
Exactly.
So
all those big YouTubers as well, Per. They always go on about how you've got to. They do the pointing down to the bottom, saying click there and give us a thumbs up or a review. So
James is right now pointing on camera.
I am. Thank you for the audio captions, Per. And the show notes, of course, and full episode archive can be found on uxpodcast.com if wherever you're listening doesn't have a full archive.
Remember to keep moving.
See you on the other side.
James, what do you call a parade of rabbits hopping backwards?
I don't know, Per. What do you call a parade of rabbits hopping backwards?
A receding hairline.
Oh.